fall into the ditches and perish. Many female religious went to their deaths in this way, singing songs to the Lord as they did so, and forgiving their captors and tormentors. In the midst of all this, there was also the de-Christianization campaign. De-Christianization campaign in France. Now, what did that consist of? During the fanaticism of de-Christianization, a new calendar was introduced. Because, of course, if we want to de-Christianize the country, we certainly can't have a calendar dated from the life of Christ. So instead, we're going to date our calendar from the year we killed our king. That'll be the year 1. And the week became 10 days long, not 7. So it became impossible for the Catholic people, after a time, to know what day was Sunday. Well, thankfully, most people never adopted this silly calendar. But that was an example of the hostility toward the Catholic people. But beyond just that, bizarre ceremonies were carried out. Statues of saints were guillotined. The names of streets that had the word saint in them had the word saint removed. Churches were vandalized everywhere and property destroyed as an attempt to try to wipe out the Christian inheritance. In fact, even worship itself was discontinued in all but the remotest areas of the country. Here was de-Christianization. In fact, even the priests who had taken the oath of loyalty to the regime were now told that was not enough. If you want to show that you are loyal to revolutionary France, you must abjure your ordination altogether. Many of them refused to do that. Thousands of them fled the country. 10,000 priests went to England alone. England, an anti-Catholic country at that time, welcomed them. And in fact, as some historians have said, like Michael Davies, in fact, what the result of that was that English people got to see Catholic priests for themselves. They no longer heard about Catholic priests just in caricature. They met these men for themselves and saw how heroic they were and what they were able to do. And it astonished them how great these men were. And this experience they had meeting all these Catholic priests went a long way in the 19th century toward lifting the restrictions against Catholicism in that country. But this is not even the worst of what happened to Catholics. A war of extermination was waged in the Vendée region of France, and this episode has been almost entirely forgotten. It was not forgotten by Pope John Paul II, who visited the Vendée region, spoke about the Vendée region in a French visit in 1996. And when we come back, we're going to talk about those men and women, what the Pope had to say, and more examples of heroism when we come back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. So I'll see you in a minute. Welcome back to the Catholic Church, builder of civilization. I'm Thomas Woods. Today we've been talking about cases in which Western civilization, in effect, has turned against her own builders. And we've seen the suffering that Catholics have endured in a great many contexts. And I'm just giving the tip of the iceberg, I promise, of what has happened to Catholics over the centuries that nobody knows about. Now, we started off talking about the French Revolution, and I mentioned that the Vendée region of France was subject to a particularly vicious campaign during the Revolution. The Vendée was the area that was most resistant to the French revolutionaries. And orders were given to go into the Vendée and exterminate these people. Every single person who was moving should be killed. People should be bayoneted and hacked to bits. They were ordered to do that. But the people of Vendée stood up and resisted the best they could. And when Pope John Paul II was in France in 1996, he was there, incidentally, to observe the 1500th anniversary of the baptism of Clovis, who was the Frankish king who accepted Christian baptism and thus bestowed upon France the title of the eldest daughter of the Church. The Pope was there to commemorate that. But he spoke about the particular sacrifice of the people in the Vendée. And he said, "You who were born in the land of the Vendée are the heirs of men and women who were courageous enough to remain faithful to the Church of Jesus Christ at a time when her freedom and independence were threatened. In the numerous acts of witness that have come down to us, it is moving to see that the people of the Vendée remained attached to their parishes and their priests in spite of the cruelty of persecution. Now today, if you even say the word Vendée, with how many people will it ring bells? Essentially none. These are episodes that are in serious danger of being forgotten. No one has taught them in the first place. But if we have respect for all peoples, we need to know about the sufferings of all peoples. Now, I'd like to make particular mention of what happened to Catholics at the beginning of the Russian Revolution. Because, of course, most Russians, inasmuch as they were Christians, were in the Orthodox Church. So we sometimes forget about the fate of the Catholic Church because it was relatively not so numerous. But still, I'm interested in this episode because of how much it reveals about anti-Catholic persecution and modern atheistic governments. Now, we're talking about the late 19-teens into the early 1920s. These are the early years of the Bolshevik Revolution, when the communists have taken over and Lenin is in charge. Now, initially, what they did was they made it a crime to engage in religious education to anyone under 18. So you can't form the minds of the children. The communists will form the minds of the children. They also made it illegal to do a variety of things. They made it very difficult, if not impossible, for the church to own property. They established atheistic propaganda and encouraged and fostered atheistic propaganda all over the place. In fact, in some cases, churches were replaced with public restrooms as a way of showing, well, the greatest possible disdain to the Christian faith of the people. I have a friend who, around about the early 1980s, perhaps the late 1970s, was being taken on a guided tour of Russia. And the tour guide was giving the usual propaganda. Look at the religious freedom we encourage in Russia. Look at all of our churches. And my friend impertinently asked, oh, how many of them were built since 1917? Total silence, of course. He was never invited back, needless to say. That's an unaskable question. But early on, early 1920s, you start to see a campaign against the Catholic churches in which the regime is claiming we need to take the valuables out of these churches, anything that might be made out of precious metals, because Russia, in large part thanks to the stupidity of its government, was suffering from a devastating famine. And the claim was, we need to melt these sacred vessels down to sell them to make money to provide for famine relief. Well, clearly, this was an attempt to break the Catholic churches, to show who was in charge. They didn't actually need that money for famine relief, because the United States and other places were sending famine relief money to Russia. And we now know, now that the Soviet archives have been opened up, that the government was taking that food aid money and using it to buy machine guns from Germany. They didn't need the money for this purpose. And in fact, Pope Benedict XV, who was Pope from 1914 to 1922, even made an offer to the Russian government. He said, the Vatican will give you an amount of money equivalent to the value of those vessels if you just leave them alone. He never got an answer to that offer, which is all you need to know. And so, in effect, stormtroopers marched into churches and began vandalizing them. Most churches were vandalized. The only ones who weren't were ones where it was determined that there was nothing sufficiently of value there. Now, beyond this, we have cases of priests being executed or imprisoned just for doing normal priestly functions, providing religious education, or trying to prevent the stormtroopers from taking their vessels. One priest, for example, got down on his knees and begged his congregation to block and protect the tabernacle. He was tried and convicted of falling demonstratively on his knees. Did you know that was a crime? That's apparently a crime. And that reminds us that in these revolutionary regimes, there is no respect for law whatsoever. Law is what the judge says it is. In fact, in Russia, historian Richard Pipes says Russia was the first country on earth to ever outlaw law. That if you wanted to be a judge in Russia, all you needed to do was be literate. You didn't have to have any legal training.